Ready? So I guess we should get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the GWSPP conference and this panel, which is on women's suffrage and political participation, historical examinations. I am Emily Conroy-Krutz. I'm moderating this panel. I'm an associate professor in the history department here at Michigan State University. And I am delighted to welcome these four speakers who are going to be giving us some really exciting food for thought and interesting presentations today. So just to give you a sense of how this session is going to go, we are going to, I will introduce the speakers and then each of them will have 15 minutes to present their work. And then we will move to a Q&A period. This is, we're going to leave ourselves plenty of time to talk and for the audience to ask questions. Thank you all so much for being here for this virtual conference. And thank you in advance for engaging closely with these wonderful papers. When we get to the time, Q&A works, there's two possibilities. The first is that you can raise your hand. There's a little blue hand. If you go to participants, you should see a button for raise hand, and you can alert me that you want to ask a question that way. And you can also use the chat function to ask a question, and we'll be monitoring both of those when we get to the Q&A. In the meantime, if everyone will remember to keep themselves muted and with their videos off, unless they are presenting, that would be wonderful. So I will introduce the speakers in the order that they will be presenting in. First off, we will have Tracey Jean Boisseau, who is an associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Purdue University. TJ has published widely on women's exposition history and is the co-editor of the first collection of essays in that field, which is titled Gendering the Fair, which came out with Illinois University Press in 2010. She's also the president of the Society for Scholarly Study of Women and Gender Expositions. She is currently working on a monograph, Women with the World at Their Feet, which spans over a century of American women's exposition history. And today's paper is drawn from a draft chapter of that new work, and her paper is titled Fair Chances, Suffrage Activism at American World's Fairs and Expositions, 1876 to 1915. After that, we'll hear from Cappy Yarbrough, who is a recent graduate of the MA program at the College of Charleston in history. She researches in US women's political history and has worked for 2 years as a graduate assistant at the Low Countries Digital History Initiative, creating online exhibits about underrepresented and marginalized South Carolina history. And she will be presenting, Did You See Any Women in Men's Clothes at the Polls? Black Women and Voting Rumors in the Reconstruction South Carolina. Then we'll hear from John Williams, who currently serves as an associate professor of American history and sociology at Collin College at McKinney, Texas. Before his career as a professor, he taught social studies at the middle and high school levels and worked in the corporate world and served in the US Marine Corps. He has a PhD in the history of ideas from the University of Texas at Dallas, and his field of study includes the First World War and the Lost Generation, Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and European immigration in the US. He will be talking to us today about Ballot, Please, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, President Ulysses S. Grant, and the election of 1872. And last, but certainly not least, we'll hear from David Collins, who practiced law in Michigan for 35 years before coming to Wayne State for his MA and PhD in history. He is a past president and visiting scholar of the American Bar Foundation and an active member of the American Law Institute. Before earning his PhD, Mr. Collins earned his BA at Amherst College and his JD at Washington University in St. Louis, where he served on the editorial board of the Law Review. He will be talking to us about women's suffrage and Pollock's Covenant, a Faustian bargain with racism, or sleeves off at the vest. So I hope you are all as excited as I am to hear these wonderful papers. And TJ, why don't you take it away?
Thanks. I am going to switch my video to screen share. And video. There we go. Hold on one second. I should be able to get to full. Oh, I need to go to start slideshow. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides. Can anyone confirm that?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try to do this super fast. I want to thank the conference organizers and you all for tuning into the conference and to the presentation. International expositions, which typically in the US are referred to as World's Fairs, provided unparalleled movement building and propaganda opportunities for suffragists. This is true throughout US exposition history, but particularly in the 10 key years for suffrage organizing between 1905 and 1915. In other words, just prior to the outbreak of World War II, when World's Fairs went on hiatus all over the world. The golden age of World's Fairs, 1850 to the outbreak of World War I, coincides with the American women's suffrage movement. And in this paper, I am going to just point to some highlights to demonstrate that this coterminance is not just coincidence. The reasons for why fairs were, I argue, not just important, but the principal factor upon which the American women's suffrage movement was built, I think are many. And I'm just going to make one contemporary analogy to try to convince you that it is this important. It would be like if in 100 years, historians who were talking about the Me Too movement forgot or just overlooked the platform of Twitter, because Twitter no longer exists and nobody knows anything about it, and they just kind of overlook the fact that much of the movement was in fact conveyed via Twitter. And that's my argument, is that is how important World's Fairs actually were to suffrage. First of all, we need to consider, if you're not familiar with World's Fairs, the opportunities of scale. Attendance to the fairgrounds of the first major American World's Fair, which is the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial, saw 10 million visitors over a 6-month period. And this is at a time when the US population stood at about 45 million. 17 years later, the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition, these are both fairs I will mention, admitted 3 times that many, 27.5 million visitors at a time when the US population was 65 million. We should also consider the consequences of fairs' frequency and regularity. Over 40 years between 1876, when the first really major US World's Fair was held, until 1915, over 40 World's Fairs took place in the US. That pace accelerated rapidly after the turn of the century. The majority actually happened after the turn of the century. And this is, of course, a historical period when women are locked out of all the ways that male leaders gather nationally and internationally normally, as heads of state, as ministers, military leaders, elected officials, as captains of industry, as media moguls. Women simply did not have other venues that brought them together internationally, at least. And this is a time when interpersonal communications were still limited to letters that might take weeks or months to be delivered by post, or at the fastest would be some sketchy telegrams. So the frequency and regularity of World's Fairs meant women could meet, devise strategy, return to their locality to implement steps, and know they would soon be able to meet again to renew their regional, national, and international affiliations at a World's Fair. Fairs created the scaffolding upon which women could build political movements in this period. And for women suffragists, isolated by vast distances, fairs were an indispensable part of their movement building and propaganda machinery. So this slide gives you a little sense of, I hope, the ideological import of World's Fairs. And speaking of propaganda, it's the ideological nature of World's Fairs that made them especially conducive to pro-suffrage interventions. They were universally celebrations of national identity, scientific and technological progress, and especially in the US, of democratic institutions, all considered the hallmarks of American modernity and American supremacy. Those fairs that celebrated originary moments in American nationalist history especially provided pro-suffrage women with the ideal context to drive home the irony of denying the franchise to them in a nation purporting to be founded on the self-evident principles of self-government. So that in sum represents my argument. And what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is just point to a few standout examples. Suffragists targeted every major fair that was in the US, including the very first, which isn't considered particularly major, but it was the first World's Fair, the 1853 New York Crystal Palace exhibition. It's often overlooked that in the wake of being expelled from an organizational meeting of the World's Temperance Convention held earlier that year, very similar to what happened most notoriously in 1848, leading female reformers reconvened at the New York World's Fair, transforming the temperance/abolition/women's suffrage protest at that fair into what Lucy Stone described as, quote, virtually a women's rights convention. That's her handwriting at the top of the screen. It would be another 25 years before the first major World's Fair would be staged in the US, when the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial came along, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Suffragists were ready to pounce on it, pushing to develop a women's committee that ironically they were barred from sitting on, outmaneuvered as they were by more well-connected elite women who were either uncomfortable with the radical idea of women's suffrage or were actually anti-suffrage. At this fair on the 4th of July, the symbolic zenith of the fair and the day of greatest attendance, Susan B. Anthony pushed forward at the height of ceremonies, just as the US Vice President finished his out loud reading of the Declaration, to hand him a scroll containing a Declaration of the Rights of Woman that had been written by Matilda Joslyn Gage and Elizabeth Cady Stanton a few weeks earlier. As expected, the Vice President refused, and immediately Anthony swept out of the hall to read it herself outside the steps, and this to a crowd of over 50,000 people who had gathered outside. The coast-to-coast press coverage of the intervention that it earned suffrage demonstrates that they were successful in upstaging the sanctioned events of the day and helped ensure the protests would live on in historical memory of the fair. Although pro-suffrage women were again entirely sidelined and kept off the board of lady managers who oversaw the 1893 Women's Building at the Chicago Columbian Exhibition, one key pro-suffrage organizer, May Wright Sewell, and you might want to remember her name, she's going to come up again, gained control over the most important event for women at that fair, the World's Congress of Representative Women. For one stunning week in May, and for the first time in world history, hundreds of female leaders in their respective fields from 27 countries were availed of a mass audience and could see each other, hear each other speak, and engage one another in dialogue. Over 300 women made over 800 speeches to over 150,000 auditors in a single week. The Congress was a smashing and history-making success. The entire program was overseen by officers of suffrage associations already in existence or specially created, and that's what that ticket there is for, as new, quote, national councils affiliated with the newly formed International Council of Women, allowing the Congress organizer and the ICW founder, May Wright Sewell, to present women's suffrage as the central issue tying all of the reforms discussed at the event together, and to present the conference as a worldwide rising of women demanding political representation as a sex and as a constituent part of human progress. Despite the mind-blowing success of these two admittedly unusual and fairly isolated examples of 19th century pro-suffrage interventions, throughout that century, suffragists were almost entirely sidelined by conservative and actively anti-suffrage women who dominated fair administrations. But after the turn of the century, suffragists found themselves in a position to turn the entire space of fairgrounds over to advocating for their cause. The first opportunity availed to suffragists to fully utilize the spaces of a World's Fair came at the Lewis and Clark Centennial held in Portland in 1905, where the largest suffrage-themed pageant staged up to that time accompanied the unveiling of a statue of Sacagawea, which pro-suffrage fair organizers positioned as a central rallying point for the fair as a whole, successfully displacing the two white men the fair had been named for, Lewis and Clark, and enshrining Sacagawea as the fair's premier symbol. Despite little to justify their reinterpretation of Sacagawea as a symbol of women's suffrage, their appropriation proved to be enormously effective propaganda for the cause. Once again, during the week of the 4th of July, a sensational parade was planned to accompany the conveyance of the statue to its pedestal, around which a pro-suffrage rally was organized. Thousands joined the procession and stayed to see Susan B. Anthony, then 85 years old and less than a year away from her own passing, give the last major speech of her life. 4 years later, at the second major fair held on the West Coast, the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle, the National American Women's Suffrage Association scheduled their first joint annual meeting for the first time on the West Coast. This brought 600 official suffrage delegates to the fair, predated by months of their cross-country travel on specially commissioned suffrage trains, as they were called, that stopped daily in large and small cities from one end of the country to the other to campaign and pick up supporters. Once again, events were timed to coincide with July 4th celebrations. Suffrage Day at the fair was officially declared on July 7th, which gave suffragists a chance to bombard the fairgrounds with their messaging during the most populous week of the fair. An ebullient Alice Stone Blackwell, daughter of Lucy Stone, noted in her fair diary how on July 7th, quote, every person entering the fairgrounds was presented with a special button and a green ribbon badge. It's the green ribbon on the left that I'm referring to. While high in the air over the grounds floated a large Votes for Women kite. By kite, what Blackwell probably meant was the dirigible trailing an enormous banner spelling out Votes for Women, large enough to be read all over the city of Seattle. Equally exciting, within a week of Suffrage Day, a pennant with the same motto fastened to a staff was carried by Dr. Cora Smith Eaton, treasurer for the Washington Equal Suffrage Association, as part of a 3-week trek up 14,000 feet to the snow-covered summit of nearby Mount Rainier. Both that mountaineering feat and the dirigible harnessed the burgeoning and public fascination with female adventurers and women firsts to the cause of suffrage, and successfully resulted in a huge boost in membership and public support for state suffrage organizations. In fact, within a year, Washington became the 5th state to grant women's suffrage. Although women had tenuous hold at the 1915 San Francisco Fair, the last major fair before the hiatus caused by World War I ensued, and suffragists' influence remained ancillary to official administration, they were still not a part of the committee. Suffragists like Alice Paul by now knew how to use a World's Fair. She made the most of the fair through elaborate events that ended up defining the fair for national newspaper readers who did not themselves travel to the fair. Paul installed the first suffrage booth from which recruiters solicited signatures from passersby to create the petition with the most signatures and of the longest physical length ever presented to the US Congress. Much fanfare and constantly changing theatrics kept fairgoers' attention on the booth and the petition. Paul arranged to have thousands of suffrage leaflets dropped onto the heads of huge crowds from an airplane, sparking curiosity among fairgoers. It also meant leaflets appeared to be fluttering down from everywhere at once, quote from a newspaper, as if conveying a message sent from the heavens. The message, of course, being that the United States should enfranchise its women. On the day signage of their petition at the suffrage booth closed, Paul orchestrated a formal vote of 3,000 women delegates to what she called the first ever International Conference of Women Workers to approve sending the now 3-mile-long petition signed by over 5,000 women to be presented to the US Congress in Washington, D.C. on the other side of the continent. They selected 2 envoys who would present the petition to the US Congress as if it were a treaty being proffered by a foreign government. Sarah Bard, you'll see her on the far left here, a senior suffrage organizer and one of the 2 envoys, was driven cross-country by a female driver and auto repair mechanic in the large cloaks, providing ample opportunities for sustained publicity over a period of 3 months. Paul arranged events in every major city it passed through, and once the petition arrived in Washington, D.C., Paul's tactical genius for spectacle went into high gear. The well-known Mary Austin designed a parade that started as soon as the auto reached the city limits. A dozen young girls in suffrage colors, followed by Mrs. John J. White as parade marshal on horseback, surrounded by a cavalry brigade and 13 women riders representing the 13 suffrage states. The suffrage flyer came next, trailed by a women's Liberty Bell, 300 invited guests, 100 more women with pennants, 20 bearers carrying the now 4-mile-long petition on huge spools, more automobiles, another cavalry squadron, and bringing up the rear, a huge marching band. When the entire procession stopped in front of the Capitol building, a double line formed to escort the petition school bearers up the steps, who dramatically let the petition slowly unfurl behind them as they climbed. I'm actually going to conclude now. I don't know how much time is spent because I haven't kept track. My first argument is that fairs serve the suffrage movement in two primary ways. One is organization building. That's harder to show. I don't have any great pictures of all the ways in which being able to meet at World's Fairs once or twice a year produced not only a national movement, but an international collaboration among suffragists. The second is easier to show you, at least more visual, and that is the propaganda opportunities, which increased exponentially after 1905 and really took advantage of not only a newly nationalized media, newspapers in other words, but also leveraged new, more theatrical publicity tactics that Alice Paul and her cohort were borrowing from the British in this period. And I have a final thought here, that we remember and celebrate the exciting 1911 and 1913 pageants and suffrage parades, but we have at the same time failed to note how connected they were to World's Fairs, or how propaganda at World's Fairs actually predates these more commemorated events, and helped end what women's historians of suffrage often refer to as the doldrums of incremental progress for women's suffrage. And after 1905, really after Portland, pushed towards achievement in the 19th century, of the 19th Amendment in rapid succession. Thank you.
Thank you so much, TJ. That was fascinating. Next up, we have Cappy.
Hello. First of all, just wanted to thank Michigan State for having me. I also want to thank my advisor and my friends and my aunt who are all here. You guys are the best. Okay. In South Carolina, following the Civil War, Black women, those identified as Negro as well as mulatto on the census, made up approximately 30% of the state's population, the largest block in the state. Black men made up approximately 28%, creating a Black majority population in South Carolina. Once Black men were enfranchised following the new 1868 Constitution, they, with the support of the Black women in their communities, voted into office the highest number of Black candidates in any state. In South Carolina, 314 Black men served political office during Reconstruction. For reference, the next closest state was Mississippi with just 226 men. Their offices ranged from local level positions to Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, Supreme Court Justice, Speaker of the House. The numbers also included 6 congressmen who represented the state at the national level, also the highest number of any state. Perhaps most tellingly of the new political landscape being crafted by South Carolina's Black majority population, however, is the fact that under Reconstruction, South Carolina elected the highest number of formerly enslaved men to office, with 130 office holders. The next closest state, Mississippi, elected just 59 formerly enslaved men. All 314 of these officials aligned themselves with the Republican Party. Black South Carolinians overwhelmingly aligned themselves with the Republican Party, which for the first time began to become representative of the state it represented. In this radically altered political landscape, a New York Herald reporter wrote in 1870, in addition to the influence of Black men, most wondrous of all changes in South Carolina since the close of the Civil War is the influence that women have gained in politics. White South Carolinians, aligned with the Democratic Party, frequently complained about Black women's intense attachment to the Republican Party, which spilled over to an equally intense distaste for the Democratic Party. Complaining that Black women represented one of the hardest obstacles the Democratic workers encountered, these women were characterized as the head and fount of opposition towards the Democratic Party's agenda of restoring power to the previous, read previous as white, power holders. Increasingly, scholarship, such as the work of Martha Jones, has begun to recognize that women's political impact in the United States stretched long before their official enfranchisement in 1920. Scholar Elsa Barkley Brown keys into this reality, arguing that while white Democrats ultimately denied African-American women the ability to obtain full freedom in the wake of the Civil War, scholars have also denied them their freedom through assuming a very limited and pessimistic vision of human possibility for them. While technically enfranchised with the 19th Amendment, Black women would not have widespread access to ballots of their own until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, they were political actors in the state long before they had their own ballots. In what Barkley Brown deems a different vision of freedom, Black women approached politics from a firmly community-oriented perspective, in which political power through the Black men in their community's ability to vote translated to political power for themselves as well. This vision is shown particularly in South Carolina with the electoral success of both Black and white Republicans. During the era in which Black women had influence within a Black male population empowered to vote. The problem with analyzing the Black women who enthusiastically embraced the Republican Party of South Carolina's Reconstruction arises quickly: a lack of source material. Black women's voices are noticeably, and not surprisingly, silent within the archival material related to the 19th century. What is not absent, however, are frequent, at times almost obsessive, rumors and conjectures from white Democrats, as well as at times Black and white Republicans, about the activities of freedwomen. This paper then will analyze the rumors that Black women were voting, as well as other reports of their activities, in order to assess the political impact of these women. The federal hearings investigating the 1876 contested election between Democratic candidate George Tillman and Republican candidate Robert Smalls over the congressional seat of the 5th District of South Carolina offers unparalleled insight into what took place at polling stations during the tumultuous 1876 election. Throughout the hearings, men were frequently asked whether or not they had seen Black women disguised or dressed as men at the polls, an indication of the rampant nature of this rumor. This question implied another question with much deeper implications. Did you see Black women dressed as men in order to vote on election day? When asked this question, Tony Kroger, a white man, responded, "No, sir, but all the women had clubs. The women swore that if their husbands voted the Democratic ticket, they intended to kill them." When asked the same question, Freedman John Mustafer responded, "The furthest that I saw them with men's clothes was when women went up with their husbands while they voted." After being pressed on the issue, Mustafer clarified, "No, I did not see women dressed in men's clothes." When interviewees were asked directly about the issue of women in men's clothes, it's notable that neither man simply said no. Instead, they qualified their no with other details of women's presence and involvement, despite the fact that they neither wore the clothes which disguised them as men or voted themselves. These men emphasized the women's involvement outside of casting ballots. In his WPA narrative, Andy Bryce, a freedman, recounted the story of Joe Foster on election day in 1876 near Winneboro, South Carolina. Foster, another freedman, arrived to the polls that day with someone Bryce described as a stranger, another person unknown to the men gathered at the polls. The Democratic supervisor of the polling station, a white man named Thomas, challenged Foster and the other person's access to the ballot box, according to Bryce, because, in them times, the colored preachers so infuriated the women that they put on breeches and voted the radical Republican ticket. Bryce explained, the stranger looked like a woman. The chaos began when Joe Foster disputed Thomas's claim and Thomas knocked Joe down. The violence continued to escalate until a pistol was supposedly dropped and upon hitting the ground went off, shooting a black bystander through the neck. At this point, the situation descended into chaos and neither Joe Foster nor the stranger were able to cast their ballots that day. This story illustrates both the pervasive nature of the rumor and the practical difficulties white surveillance created for the possibility of women voting themselves. Rumors that women wore men's clothing in order to vote did not begin in 1876. During the 1870 election, the Daily Phoenix, an ardently Democratic publication, reported rumors were circulating in Lawrence that Republican community organizer Joe Cruz exhorted the Negroes to dress their women in men's clothes and vote them. The language of this article is particularly revealing of Democrats' attitude toward the women. Whereas Bryce characterized the women as energetically taking the ballot into their own hands, this Democratic newspaper casted them as passive pawns of the local Republican men rather than independent political actors. This particular article conceded that despite the rumors, if women had dressed as men in order to vote, on this occasion, it has not yet been discovered. Outside of Election Day activism, freed women were deeply involved in one of the most important functions of Reconstruction politics, public meetings and orations hosted by the Republican Party. Plantation ledgers across the state show planters, in many cases former enslavers turned employers, noting the absence of women who went along with their husbands to Republican meetings. Lucy McMillan, a freed woman who lived near Spartanburg, was begged by her neighbors to attend a Republican speaking on their behalf and to report back to them what was said. In a tragic indication of the danger women faced for political and community leadership, the local Ku Klux Klan, led by a man she had helped raise while she was enslaved, burned her home down when rumors were spread that she was boasting about expanding her property rights, a concept she had learned from the Republican speaking. In Republican meetings, as well as in church meetings, which frequently took on deeply political tones, women were called upon directly to act as moral guides to the men in their lives and to ensure they voted Republican, a task which it would appear some took on with vigor. Most likely influenced by a long history of hypersexualizing Black women, men, both Black and white, were particularly prone to reporting that Black women would deny their husbands sexual access to themselves based on their husband's political action. In his WPA narrative, freedman Mac Taylor reported after one election he didn't make it to the polls to vote, his wife Nancy refused to sleep with him for 6 months as punishment. One Republican newspaper reported a similar dispute taking place publicly during the 1876 election, where a woman demanded her husband publicly recant his pledge to vote for Democrat Wade Hampton. According to the newspaper, the husband did so in front of 400 people because his wife refused to sleep with him. Outside of sexual denial, Black women were just as frequently cited as perpetrating social and religious prescription towards non-Republican voting Black men. Democratic accounts often emphasized a violent image of these women. The 1876 contested election trial records are filled with testimonies that said that women marched their husbands up to the ballot box in order to ensure they voted Republican, and that some even physically tore Black men from the ballot box if they appeared to be voting Democrat. One man claimed he saw freed women armed with hickory sticks featuring 4 exposed nails in the shape of a cross and daring their husbands to try voting the Democratic ticket. While women's violence was typically portrayed by Democrats as being aimed at their own husbands, it's equally probable these weapons were pointed not towards their family members, but towards white Democrats as a measure of protection from them. Regardless of who these weapons were pointed towards or what actual violence was perpetrated, these women clearly made very public declarations of their stake in their husbands' votes. In reality, the majority of freed women and men shared similar political views and acted as partners rather than adversaries in the political field. The story of freedwoman Tess Calhoun illustrates the complexities that arose around Election Day, as well as the extents women went to in order to aid the men in their lives' ability to vote. In 1868, Calhoun filed a complaint with the Freedmen's Bureau that while at a polling station with two freedmen, perhaps neighbors or relatives, that Ned Marion had deceived them by handing them Democratic ballots and telling them they were Republican. Upon looking around, Calhoun found there were no Republican ballots at all, and she promptly went to the Freedmen's Bureau to report the injustice. Though not a voter herself, the complaint is filed under her name, not the men in her company. In this story, Calhoun is not a violent renegade of the Republican Party, rather a measured and concerned community member utilizing the legal assistance available to her, aiding the Republican cause without a vote of her own. While Democrats reported freed women as a menacing and chaotic presence at the polls, women's presence was equally likely to be supportive as well as vigilant and engaged. Despite the best efforts of freed women and men, by 1877, the dreams of a more egalitarian society had been severely damaged in the rising tide of white supremacy which drove the Redemption era. This tide crushed South Carolina Republicans when elections across the state gave way to intense voter fraud and intimidation carried out by the Democratic Party and the Wade Hampton Red Shirt campaign. Whether or not freed women voted themselves, it is clear that in South Carolina's Reconstruction, during a time in which African American men exercised unprecedented levels of power in the state government, African American women also found a certain level of success and saw potential for more. Freed women's impact was felt in their mobilization around maintaining the Republican electoral success, which they knew was crucial to protecting and expanding their hard-won freedoms. Their presence at meetings and polling stations across the state was an assertion of this freedom, the display of a deeply held belief that their voices, their dreams, their needs deserve to be understood.
Thank you so much, Cappy. That was wonderful. Next up, we have John. Unmute yourself and turn your video back on. Sorry, John, we can't hear you. Hang on just 1 second. I can't.
I think he's muted, Emily.
He is not actually, which is what's surprising about it.
Emily, there might be a problem with his mic. John,
with the microphone, yeah.
Mic? I'm not sure what we could do on our end in terms of tech.
Maybe if you made him a co-host.
Yep, he is a co-host. I'll try to mute you and unmute you. The school of turning things off and back on sometimes helps.
Maybe don't make him a co-host.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry, John. Let's see. Okay, I think he's gonna
Logged out.
try to log back in just a second. Okay, why don't we switch up the order? David, are you ready to go now?
Yes, I can go. Let me start my video. There we
Thank you.
go. Well, thank you, Emily. Appreciate the chance to join the conference and the order of the program is inherited from me the position of being the last speaker before the cocktail hour. So I hand that off to him very much. I want to talk about what I call Pollock's Covenant, which is a stunning moment in the history of Senate debate on the 19th Amendment. I say stunning not because it stunned anyone on the Senate floor that day in 1919, but it's stunning to 21st century sensibilities, certainly, and maybe stunning to us because it was so unstunning to them, but we'll get to that. It came very near the finish line of the 19th Amendment, just a few months before the Senate finally approved the amendment in June of 1919. The self-styled covenant was offered up by South Carolina Democrat William Pollock in brief and very candid remarks that encapsulate three key points in understanding the Senate's long struggle with the question of women's suffrage, and to understanding especially the less than glorious side of the movement's triumph in that struggle. The first point is that Pollock's covenant illuminates the racism that pervaded advocacy for women's suffrage, not only at the conclusion of the struggle in 1919, but through most of the movement's history. The second is the persistent 50-year-long friction between the 15th Amendment and the 19th. Now, the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited the denial of voting rights on account of race. It was designed for freed slaves mostly. But that amendment sort of cast a long shadow over the 19th Amendment and shaped its development, or at least the progress of the debate. And finally, better than any single moment in the lengthy Senate debate, Pollock's covenant illuminates the original intent of the framers of the 19th Amendment. It shows that the practical effect of the 19th Amendment in the contemplation of the Senate framers and the advocates would be white women's suffrage. We'll get to the particulars of Pollock's covenant in a moment, but first let me elaborate on that friction I mentioned, because it very profoundly shaped the debate in the South about the 19th Amendment. The tension started shortly after the Civil War, when the leaders of the women's suffrage movement grudgingly stood aside and allowed the 15th Amendment to take precedent over their amendment. The suffragists had high hopes of securing women's suffrage shortly after the Civil War, but so did the abolitionists. So a competition kind of developed between these two movements. And in the argument, the abolitionists prevailed. This is the Negro's hour. You'll remember Wendell Phillips coined that phrase. The women's movement leaders acquiesced, but only after voicing objections and in racist terms. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in particular argued that Black men, because they were inferior to white women, white women should not have to take a back seat. They stated this very matter-of-factly in their advocacy. But the 15th Amendment went forward ahead of the 19th, was ratified in 1870, and the women's movement, in a sense, just waited its turn. Women suffrage leaders were perhaps entitled to expect that their sacrifice would pay eventual dividends, easing the way for passage of their amendment by earning goodwill and ending the competition between the two movements. But in fact, as women soon learned, there was absolutely no return on this investment, on this standing down. Nothing was gained by it for the women's movement. In fact, it turned out to be, for the women's movement, worse than nothing. First, that's because within 10 years of ratification of the 15th Amendment, it had become virtually a dead letter as Southern states found ways to evade it, including elaborate legal contrivances. And second, it turned out to be worse than nothing because Southerners held up their experience with the 15th Amendment and their loathing of it. And that amendment's failure, they held up all these things as objections to the 19th Amendment. They were saying, in effect, don't do this to us again. Southerners had that frame of mind. Don't make us create a whole new set of contrivances to thwart voting rights, this time for African American women. It's hard to overstate the loathing of the 15th Amendment among Southern senators. They absolutely detested it. We might ask, what explains the loathing? Well, it was not the political power it conferred on African American men. In practice, certainly by 1919, it had conferred no power at all. And it wouldn't for another 45 years, 46 years, I guess, with the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So if it wasn't that it conferred political power on African, why the loathing? Southern senators were very candid in explaining their attitude. First, they resented what they saw as the rank hypocrisy of Northern whites who had imposed the 15th Amendment on them without any, if you will, skin in the game themselves. Northern senators, as their Southern colleagues saw it, had no moral high ground in the matter. They shared the racist views of the South, but had nothing to lose from enfranchising African Americans because there were so few African Americans in the North. A little bit of data on that. Cappy touched on this for Charleston. In South Carolina, talking about the 1920 census, in South Carolina and in Mississippi, whites were a minority of the population. In Louisiana, whites were barely a majority. In contrast to that, in Michigan, there were 60 whites for every African American in the population. And in New Hampshire, there were 712 whites for every African American. So the Southerners, as the Southerners saw it, Northern whites risked nothing from the 15th Amendment. But for Southern white supremacists, it had been an existential threat. A second reason for the loathing was that Southern senators had been, to their way of thinking, had been forced by the 15th Amendment into the hard labor legislatively of the convoluted contrivances that were necessary to circumvent the 15th Amendment. in effect, they had to get their hands dirty in the unbecoming business of dodging a constitutional obligation. They were very unapologetic for the circumvention itself of the 15th Amendment. They felt they had no choice in that matter, but they found it demeaning to have to go to all that trouble. And indeed, they had labored hard. We'll see this, how this reference to this surfaces in Pollock's covenant. They had labored hard. Their main legal device, and bear in mind there were extra non-legal devices for evading the 15th Amendment, mainly violence. But the main legal device for the evasion were amendments to state constitutions, adding new qualifications for voting rights. On their face, these provisions were racially neutral, although their purpose was very clearly to block African-American voting. Specifically, there were literacy requirements added to the Southern state constitutions, designed and administered to disqualify African-American men. And there were also poll taxes, which many African-American men could not afford. Excuse me, let me close this door. I'm getting some feedback here. Sorry about that. The trouble, a problem arose because literacy tests and poll taxes also barred many lower class white men. And to solve that problem, Southern voting laws took on a Rube Goldberg quality as elaborate exemptions were grafted onto the contrivances blocking votes. The exemptions would let whites through the door. As I'm reading these statutes, appalling as the goal was, you have to kind of admire the craftsmanship that got through all these obstacles. The most common form of exemption was the grandfather clause. Our use of that word derives from its invention in this context. The grandfather clause said that anyone who was eligible to vote before Reconstruction automatically became a registered voter and was spared the literacy test and poll taxes. That would only be white men, because only white men could vote before Reconstruction. And the exemption applied also to their sons and their grandsons, and that's the grandfather clause. Another form of exemption from literacy tests and poll taxes, also tailored, of course, to apply only to white men, was an exemption for Civil War veterans and their sons, both North and South. In the South, those veterans were always white. The military exemption is particularly interesting because it came back to bite the architects of the idea when World War I ended and African-American war veterans returned to their Southern homes. The war, it's a larger subject than we can get into here, but the war had politicized these men, and the veterans exemption created an unexpected problem for the white power structure when the veterans, black veterans, demanded to be registered as voters, asserting in that demand the logic of the veterans exemption drafted to apply on veterans. The logic supported their demands, and this was alarming to Southern white supremacists. Here is a quote from Mississippi Senator James Vardaman on this subject. He said, "The military Negro out of harness is a menace to the peace and prosperity of any country governed by the white man." So his solution, the solution of men like Vardaman, was to support the 19th Amendment. not because they expected any black women to vote, but because they expected white women to vote, and the white women voting would offset the black veterans vote. So all of this was you see in the debate, an irritant to the Southern sensibilities of the senators, because they knew this looked ridiculous, and they felt that they'd been forced into it by the unreasonable 50. So that brings me to the covenant. Now let me see if I can pull this off. I'm going to pull up my screen here. Here is the language of the covenant. I'll get this on the full screen here. I think, yeah. All right. Can we see that? I hope so. I'll read it to you. This is Pollock, Senator Pollock, on the Senate floor, and he's addressing his northern colleagues. He's announced his support of the 19th Amendment, but it's with the support is conditioned on this covenant that he's proposing. So it says, I covenant with you, hold on a second, it's easier to, I covenant with you and you covenant with me that you will do under this amendment as you have done under the 15th Amendment. You will not undertake to place in control over us a race of people you would never allow to govern you. The white men have outvoted the Negro men, and that under trying conditions, and God helping us from this day forward, the white men and the white women will outvote the Negro man and the Negro woman. The trying conditions that Pollock is talking about here are the evasive legislation, the suppression tactics that we just mentioned. In supporting and appealing to Northern senators, his Northern colleagues, Pollock made an argument, but I'm not getting, well, I'll read it. Here's what he said. He said that Northern white men, quote, appreciate the burden of the white men in the South. He said, blood is thicker than water. He's talking about white blood, thicker than water. But he's reaching out to his colleagues, appealing to the common racism among them for an understanding of what he expects from them in exchange for his vote. Let me wrap up here. A lot of what characterized the advocacy and passage of the 19th Amendment was packed into Pollock's statement there. First, obviously, the racism. There was this sort of matter-of-fact recognition that the 15th Amendment was a dead letter, thanks to the hard labors of legislators in the South. There was a seeking of assurance from Northerners that the 19th Amendment would be a dead letter too, as to African-American women. There was no express concurrence. If you read the Senate debate, nobody said, okay, we agree. But nor did anyone reproach Pollock. Nobody said, this is an outrage, Senator. How could you propose such a thing? There was kind of a tacit acceptance of the premise of what Pollock was saying. And there was no need for express concurrence because everybody in the Senate understood that there would be no congressional enforcement of the 19th Amendment on behalf of African-American women. That was unimaginable to anybody. It was a very safe assumption. And of course, there would be no enforcement for another 45 years with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But in that sense, Pollock's covenant was an expression of the original intentions, I think we say the original intentions of the framers of the 19th Amendment. It was an expression of their expectation that the 19th Amendment would achieve voting rights, but only for white women. This is kind of depressing stuff, I think we can agree. And it begs the question, or raises the question, whether there's anything good in this story. Can we feel good about it? Given the way the 19th Amendment came into existence under this awful cloud, what can we feel good about? Well, I think we need to remind ourselves of some obvious things. The amendment passed the Senate with unqualified language. Pollock's ideas did not find their way into the text of the amendment. It included and includes Section 2, which confers power on Congress to enforce the amendment. And in a way, you could see Pollock's covenant is seeking an understanding that that wouldn't happen. But the language is there, and it did eventually happen, not till 1965. From the point of view of African American women, this is a totally unacceptable compromise, I guess, or delay. But if we think of it as Martin Luther King thought of the Constitution in his 1963 I Have a Dream speech, think of it as a promissory note. Eventually, the debt was paid. It was paid later than we like to, than we wish it had been, but nevertheless, it was paid. It couldn't have happened without passage of the 19th Amendment. We might consider a counterfactual scenario. There was one senator from Idaho. His name was William Borah, excuse me. He's a Republican. He was a progressive. Idaho had women's suffrage in its law. And Borah, nevertheless, opposed the 19th Amendment. And the logic he offered was that it was so evident to him, as it was to everybody in the Senate, that this was going to be a sham. As to Black women, this was going to be a sham. And Borah spoke for the whole Senate, or he thought he understood the whole Senate as agreeing to acquiesce in the sham. And for that reason, he thought that persuaded him to oppose the amendment. That was a principled position. The counterfactual scenario is, what if that position had prevailed and the 19th Amendment had gone down to defeat for the reasons that Borah argued? It would be hard to point to that, I think, as a success, at least now in hindsight. So with that, I think I'll wind up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And quite the counterfactual to end us on. Okay, so John, let's see if we can get this working now. I can't know. Okay, are you going to try to dial in with on the phone? Setting it up, perfect, excellent. So while John gets that set up, I'll just remind the audience that after his presentation, we'll turn to Q&A. I know I already have a lot of questions in my mind based on what we've heard already. You can do that through the chat or by raising your blue hand. If you go to the participants tab, you should find a hand raise option.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, how about now?
You're perfect. I can hear you.
Oh my God.
All right, let me make you co-host here so that you can share your screen.
Yeah.
Or if you want, you can quickly email me your slides and I can share my screen.
Yeah, let me do that. Crap.
Joys of Zoom.
I sent them. You got them now.
Okay. Not seeing them in yet, but I will post them as soon as they come through. If you want to get started, and then you can just tell me when.
Yeah, sure. First off, I'm sorry for all the technical difficulties. My name is Professor Williams. I'm associate professor at Collin College. And the title of my presentation is Ballot, Please, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, President Ulysses S. Grant in the election of 1872. The genesis of this project is a byproduct of my dissertation, where I examined General Grant's or President Grant's civil rights record with minority groups, namely African Americans, Jews, and Native Americans. And during the course of my writings, I kept thinking in the back of my mind that when I got to my oral examination of my dissertation, someone was going to ask me about women. And I really didn't have a body of knowledge put together on that. So slowly but surely, I started putting scraps of information off to the side in the hopes that at some point I could do something with it. And lo and behold, this conference came up, and I decided to make a presentation, and I hopefully you guys will enjoy it. Now, during and after the Civil War, leading abolitionists and suffragists had championed a program of economic existence, education, and equal rights for freedmen. Now, the women who took up the fight for the rights of their own sex began in many instances throwing themselves into the battle of liberation of Blacks, and the future of these civil rights amendments would also include their efforts as well to be enfranchised. Now, the anti-slavery and women's rights movement grew up so closely that many could not distinguish between the two. Both movements utilized fairs, petitions, publications, conventions, and political protests effectively to advance their causes. While Susan B. Anthony championed the women's cause, Frederick Douglass led the abolitionist movement towards civil rights for African Americans. As early as 1848, Douglass succeeded in defining the National Negro Convention platform to include women in their plea for enfranchisement. However, between 1866 and 1872, abolitionists and the suffragettes had been at odds over the terms of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Leading abolitionist Frederick Douglass started to distance himself from this movement, including women in the enfranchisement granted to Blacks, because he felt as though it may threaten its passage, namely the 15th Amendment. In response, Susan B. Anthony pleaded with both the Republican and Democratic parties to support their passage of a new amendment to enfranchise women voters, which they saw that could be potential for the 16th Amendment. The rights of women and the rights of Blacks who were enjoined were shattered by two Civil War amendments, the 14th and the 15th. The use of the word male citizens in the 15th Amendment shattered the camaraderie that both groups had once shared. And Anthony's charge was, look at this, all of you, I hear me swear that I will cut off this right arm of mine before I'll ever work and demand a ballot for a Negro and not the women. Now, Douglass, on the other side, feared that the newly freed slave survival was also tied to the ballot box. It was only the ballot box that could provide access to education and guard painfully won economic foundations. It was also the ballot box that could protect them from the KKK who were conspiring against them in the South. Now, while ranks were starting to close on the women's side, it now became a mere custom of how the law in the eyes of the federal government would be put forth. Women closed ranks to fight over the use of an adjective that excluded them from the right they so rightfully deserved, which was the 15th. Appeals, speakers, petitions crisscrossed the nation, but to no avail. To win the fight of a new amendment was taken up by Susan B. Anthony, the National Women's Suffrage Association, to Washington, D.C. Anthony and the NAASA took their appeal directly to President Grant and the Republican Party in 1872. Taking their appeal to Grant and the Republican Party was keeping with their activism while playing both sides. This intention included lobbying elected officials for female suffrage, equal gender pay, and protection of property for women. Shortly after being elected in 1868, President Grant signed into law the protection of married women's property from their husbands' deaths and the ability of women to sue in court in Washington, D.C. While these gains were significant, they waned as the Republican Party started to bring closure to Reconstruction. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony turned to Grant once again and the Republicans. Anthony went straight to the White House to plead her case. She told the president that the National Women's Suffrage Association wanted him to make efforts to have the votes for women on the Republican plank in 1872. While Grant was warned to her request, he argued party planks were an issue of Republican committee. He reminded Anthony that he had done as much as he could for the employment of women through the Postal Service. To his credit, he appointed over 5,000 women to federal posts, more than any other president before him. This effort included equal pay provisions for women working in the federal government, and this was done through what they call the Arnell Bill of 1870. The Arnell Law increased women's clerks' pay from 4% to 20% throughout most of the 1870s. However, the cultural patronage and patriarchy continued to thrive, all part of the spoils system. Now, to placate the burgeoning suffragette movement, the Republican Party included language that said women's rights should be treated with respectful consideration, while Grant advocated equal rights for all citizens. Now, despite accusations of corruption that were swirling around Grant's administration, he was still a popular president. And at the 1872 National Convention, he was unanimously nominated for a second term. This party platform advocated high tariffs, continued radical Reconstruction policy that supported 5 military districts in the southern states. In the end, Anthony's delegation had to accept a campaign plank that soothingly cited Republican obligations to the loyal women of America for noble devotion to the cause of freedom and to the cause, and the hope that their admission to wider fields of usefulness. Nevertheless, this plank ended with the statement, the honest demands of any class of citizens for equal rights should be treated with respectful consideration. Up until this point, no national party had ever said these words before. Even though these efforts included women's suffrage on the Republican Party platform, Anthony and her supporters stuck with Grant and the Republican Party. Gains made under Grant were hard to ignore, and Anthony and the other leading suffragettes believed that the Republicans were their best bet in the upcoming election. Democratic candidate for President Horace Greeley, who was once warned to the suffragettes' cause, had turned hostile and let it be known publicly, the best women I know do not want to vote. Anthony would go on speaking tours on behalf of Grant. She was convinced without a particle of doubt that in fact, constitutional already guaranteed women's right to vote. She took the words to heart. Anthony was steadfast in her belief that the new 14th and 15th Amendments assured it. The 14th, just 4 years old, decreed that all persons born and naturalized in the United States are citizens, and no state shall make or enforce any law that shall abridge the privileges and immunities of its citizens. While the 15th was added in 1870, it prohibited any state from withholding the right to vote on any citizens on account of race, color, and previous condition of servitude. Suffragists argued that there could be no justifiable cause for excluding women from the vote, since the 14th also included the caveat that no state should deny any person the equal protection under the law. Totally convinced women's constitutional the right to vote, Anthony decided to present herself to the Board of Registry on a designated day, on election day, where she would cast her ballot. Anthony's efforts to cast the ballot had been supported by Henry R. Selden, a former judge of the New York Court of Appeals in the state of Supreme Court. Now, Selden had never considered this issue, but he agreed to review it, and after doing so, told Anthony amendments did guarantee women's right to vote, and he promised to support her claim. Support for her ballot also came from several newspapers who advocated her right to vote. Anthony gathered 15 other women, included her 3 sisters, and appeared that very day before the startled Board of Registry in a barbershop in Rochester, New York's 8th Ward. Following the lead, 35 other women also came to register in wards, and this action was denounced by local newspapers, which demanded prosecution of any elected official who accepted their ballots. The paper published the central features of the enforcement of this act of the 14th Amendment by stating, any person who shall vote without having the legal right to do so, or do any unlawful act to secure or any opportunity to vote for himself or any other person, shall be deemed quality of a crime, punishable by fine of $500 and or imprisonment of up to 3 years. The warning was so intimidated that on election day, no official in any ward except the 8th ward permitted women to vote. 16 registered women did arrive to vote. The polls opened, they voted, and they found the same 3 men that had registered them early waiting for them. The women asked for ballots, they received them, they all voted. Most of the ballots were returned to Jones or Marsh, but even the third one who reclused himself had accepted some. The women went home, the ballots were counted, and the story was telegraphed across the nation. On Thanksgiving Day, Thursday, November 28th, Anthony was arrested for having illegally voted and having violated the Act of Congress. The marshals served them warrants on her and her 3 sisters in parts of the city, and deputies were calling on the 12 other women. The 16 women were brought into a bleak, dirty courtroom where only a few years before runaway slaves had been held awaiting trial. While waiting for the verdict, President Grant had arranged for a pardon and remission of the fines incurred. Anthony was never pardoned because she was never jailed. This, in the long term, would hurt her cause because the fact that she wasn't jailed, she couldn't appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Judge Selden did appeal to both houses of Congress for remission of her fine, basing on his claim of a proceeding of a publisher who had been jailed under the same circumstances under the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Now, inclusion, the resolve of Susan B. Anthony and other suffragettes serves an example of doing the right thing for all the right reasons, no matter the effort put forth and the difficulties faced. The long cause of women's enfranchisement was long overdue when passed in 1920. Despite the fact that Congress, public will, and the executive branch were suspect in their support throughout, the goal was finally reached. The potential for 16th Amendment franchising women to vote lost momentum after the 1872 election. The fact that so many states had made Black enfranchisement hard to fulfill made women's enfranchisement even harder to accomplish. In 2020, there are more women serving in Congress than ever before. We're now on the cusp of having a first woman vice president. Job well done.
Well, that is an excellent note to end on. And I'm so sorry the slides did not come through in my email. So thank you for doing a wonderful job of reading that, though. It's still a very engaging paper. So we'll turn our attention to Q&A now if the other panelists want to turn their video back on so that the audience can see them. And if those who have questions would like to raise them in the chat while we're waiting for audience questions to come through. I was just so impressed by all these papers. I was really struck by the way that the 4 of you are engaging in similar themes, but looking at different groups of political actors across these different papers. And so we saw a range of takes from high politics to local politics and really engaging discussion about propaganda. And of course, race was a thread throughout. And so I wanted to maybe start us off there and see if TJ, you wanted to speak a little bit about the ways that sort of the racism that was so much a part of this era of the suffrage movement played out in the World's Fairs context.
It was really hard to cut that out of my paper. I so badly wanted to get just some basic evidence out there that I ended up having to slash and burn the way in which the fair administrations were highly exclusionary. And I guess there's an argument to be made that the men's fair administration was also clearly highly exclusionary. But because women really fought very hard for the toehold that women were sometimes given at different fairs when there was a women's committee or a board of lady managers, or there was permission given to fundraise for a women's building. That space was so highly contested that not only were suffragists almost entirely barred from participation, very, very specifically because they were suffragists and they were perceived as radicals, and that they would inject controversy and divisiveness. And so they were really elbowed out of the way. But of course, they, women of color were kept off as much as possible. There are exceptions when the organizing of Black women was so effective that there was some limited tokenism. But for the most part, the more conservative and very elite and elitist women that really governed women's exhibits at World's Fairs very systematically made sure that non-white women, politicized women, working class, forget working class women, there was no way. So that happened a lot. The one Congress of representative women that I mentioned, the World's Congress in 1893, it's interesting for a host of reasons. One of the things that is interesting about it is at a height of the segregationist America and this exclusionary practices at World's Fairs, May Wright Sewell not only invited 6 Black women to speak. It doesn't sound like a lot, maybe, but 6 of the leading Black women very respectfully and invited. They didn't have to bang down the door. They were welcomed. It is really noticeable. I'm not saying that May Wright Sewell was. I really don't know. What her overall consistency in terms of anti-racism was, but that is really noticeable. And it also is noticeable that not only did she invite Black American women, she invited women from colonized spaces. I mean, we might call them third world countries, but at the time to speak. She also invited actresses and gave them pride of place and put them up on the dais to speak. And this is really shocking at the time, because actresses, there really is no difference between a stage actress, even if they're doing Shakespeare, and the status that is afforded to porn stars in our own, period. So the fact that she was really ecumenical really made the World Congress a representation, just historic in a lot of ways, and it also really changed the conversation. So, there's lots more to be said about race exclusion at fairs, and I'll just say one more thing, which is that not only did Black women and Black men and women really systematically protest every single major World's Fair that existed. They're protesting their exclusion, but they also organized alternative fairs. They were called Negro Expositions. And they, especially after 1900, you see many of them, and they've been written about, and they are really important spaces for Black civil rights organizing and community organizing, and Black women's organizing as well.
Thank you so much. David asked the question that I think maybe some of us have been thinking with a lot as we've been sort of approaching this centenary year, right? What is there to feel good about as we're telling these incredibly important stories about exclusion and racism within the women's suffrage movement? I think you all told some stories that are really powerful and give us a lot of the good, complicated, and good to think with kind of histories of this. But I wanted to kind of give you the opportunity to take on that question of how do we approach this year in which the 19th Amendment is being celebrated so much, even as so many of you talked about in your papers, the sort of full enfranchisement of women in this country did not happen in 1920. So they don't want to take on that sort of big existential question about 100 years.
I think one thing that's been really important and interesting, given the current political turmoil, as someone who studies Reconstruction, the parallels have just been frightening of accusations of fraud, of violence in streets. It's been really interesting. And the fact that all of it is taking place at the 100th anniversary of women's enfranchisement, which is why we're all here to celebrate it. I think that I was really excited that several of the papers really delved into race, because I think that the parallels in this centennial year are impossible to ignore. And so I think that that is such an important thing to focus on this year.
Now I'm muted. Turning over to the chat, I'm seeing John is providing a link here to a Politico piece on Victoria Woodhull, and sort of drawing your attention to that. As Cappy said, there's a great book on her and on that. Any other questions from the crowd? Okay, well, I think we're hitting the end of our time. Thank you guys so much for wonderful papers. So audience, please, if we were in the room, we would all be joining in clapping. This was wonderful. Thank you all for being here for this conference, this virtual meeting. And I hope to see all of you in a little bit at Governor Whitmer's address. So have a lovely evening and thank you all.